Hey guys, so the next set of pathways we're going to do is the basal ganglia pathways. These can be a little daunting at first because it's just some crazy names, lots of positive and negative synapses, but once you follow kind of this simple schematic, it actually becomes pretty approachable. I do want to say I do this one a little differently than my others, so normally I encourage you to really know the structures first before you're doing this. And this one I actually think it's easier to know your schematic before you apply it to a gross brain. So actually, from first test, you should feel pretty comfortable identifying some of these structures between the caudate, the putamen, globus pallidus, externa, interna, and then your substantia nigra. This right here, what you're looking at, is an awesome diagram which Emily made, which you can find on the website, that actually has the schematic that I'm about to do here placed onto the actual brain. But I really would encourage you to do it here because then it becomes very easy to do on the brain as opposed to doing it vice versa. Okay, so first a couple of ground rules before we start with this. I have some structures drawn out here. These are duplicate structures, if you notice. So when I set this up, I set up both the direct and the indirect pathway the same exact way, with the motor cortex here, the striatum, the GPI, and the VA thalamus, as well as substantia nigra pars compacta. I'm going to add a couple of structures for the indirect pathway in a bit, and I'm also going to add some structures for eye movement, as basal ganglia has something to do with that. When I draw this, blue is going to be an excitatory, which is typically done by glutamate, but can also be done by dopamine to D1 receptors. And then red is going to be inhibitory, which is typically GABA, but can also be dopamine to D2 receptors. I'll show that in a bit as well. And then just a couple of quick rules to always remember. Basal ganglia is always going to be releasing GABA, no matter what. So if you're running through this and I just draw this, I don't have to think like, oh, it's the first one excitatory and inhibitory. I just think, oh, the first one comes from the motor cortex. That's not basal ganglia, so that's going to be excitatory. There is one exception here, which has to do with the substantia nigra, but we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's start. So first, the direct pathway, which has to do with positive reinforcement of movement, so kind of smoothing out your movements, reinforcing and chaining them together. So what's going to happen? So this is motor cortex, which is not basal ganglia, so that's going to release a positive glutamate neurotransmitter onto the striatum. Remember, the striatum is the caudate nucleus and the putamen combined. Striatum, we know this is part of the basal ganglia, so this is going to release a negative signal on the GPI. Since the GPI is also, or globus pallidus interna, is also part of the basal ganglia, that will release a negative signal on the thalamus, specifically the VA-VL thalamus. And then because the thalamus is not in the basal ganglia, that's going to release a positive signal. So if you notice here, one final rule that I didn't speak about is I kind of like to call it the negative times a negative is a positive rule. So when you're thinking about this, in this case, two wrongs do make a right, I guess. So if you look here, we have two negatives, which is actually you're going to be inhibiting an inhibitor and thus causing a positive circuit. So in here there gets to be a lot of positive and negatives. I always just count the number of negatives. If it's an even number, so say 2 right here, then I know it's going to have a positive result eventually. Otherwise, it's going to be negative. I'll show you what I mean in a second on the indirect pathway. Last thing in the direct pathway is that our substantia nigra pars compacta, so PC, is going to release dopamine. The substantia nigra pars compacta always releases dopamine, but here specifically it's going to target D1 receptors, making it positive. So again, all this with two negatives is causing a very positive cycle that just turns over and over. Okay, so that's your direct pathway. So make our indirect pathway. Again, I start with the same structures. I'm going to add 2 in. So right above my GPI here, I'm going to add my GPE, globus pallidus externa. And then in this region here, I'm going to add my subthalamic nucleus. So again, this isn't anatomically correct. This is just the schematic I do to remember it. So same rules apply. So motor cortex is not basal ganglia, so it's going to have a positive synapse. Striatum is, it's going to be negative. Globus pallidus externa is, so it's negative. Subthalamic nucleus is not, so it's positive. Globus pallidus interna is part basal ganglia, so it's going to be negative. And then our VA-VL thalamus is of course not, so that is also positive. So here we have 3 negatives, so it's not 2 wrongs make a right. At this point it's 3, so it's going to be an inhibitory pathway. So that's why our indirect pathway normally is used to stop movement. However, if you notice here, the substantia nigra pars compacta, which again releases dopamine, is going to release dopamine, but this time on D2 receptors. D2 receptors are going to be inhibitory. And so by doing this, now we have 4 negatives So at this point, 2 wrongs make a right, 2 wrongs make a right. We have overall a positive pathway. So this makes sense to me because I can think that dopamine has to do with movement. When you learn more about Parkinson's, you'll learn that the substantia nigra pars compacta is specifically what wears out. And that's why people have low movement, because not only can they not stimulate this direct pathway, but they also can't turn off this indirect pathway. So if I don't have this, I have 3 negatives and I have an indirect or an inhibitory pathway. If I add dopamine, then that turns that inhibitory pathway into a positive pathway. I hope that makes sense. Okay, the last thing we want to do with this is add these in for the eyes as well. So with both of these, the eyes kind of have their own structures. It's the exact same pathway, but just the eyes replace a few structures. So instead of my motor cortex, I have my frontal eye fields. Motor cortex becomes the frontal eye fields in the eye pathway. And the GPI instead is the substantia nigra pars reticulata. So not compacta, reticulata. Substantia nigra pars reticulata. Good handwriting. Okay. So now that we have that, it's again the same rules apply. So not part of basal ganglia, frontal eye fields will release that. Striatum then always inhibits, so it's going to inhibit my substantia nigra pars reticulata. Now, this is the one exception I talked about earlier. The pars reticulata is not part of the basal ganglia, but because it's basically replacing GPI, I remember that it still is. So it's going to still release an inhibitory GABA in this case, as all of these are, but it's not dopamine, remember. Same with here. I know that my frontal eye fields also will release positive, and then I know when I get down here, my subthalamic nucleus, is going to release a positive on the substantia nigra pars reticulata, which will later inhibit my VA-VL thal. So the eye pathways are actually pretty easy. All you have to do is draw the exact same pathway. And just replace your motor cortex with your frontal eye fields and your GPI with your substantia nigra pars reticulata. Okay. And then, as I said, once you feel comfortable with this, that's when you go here. Look at the growth structures and kind of map it out. I just can know in my head that the striatum, which is the caudate and the putamen, is then going to synapse on the GPI. So I can draw an arrow to here, as Emily did. And then I will do the whole pathway. All right, and that's the basal ganglia.